Statistically, you shouldn't survive a plane crash or a terrorist attack. But when you do, you think you're invincible. You're wrong. Today, we'll look at the cruel irony of the Final Destination effect. 6 people who cheated death in the morning and were taken by fate in the evening. Viewers beware, these are real events. Learn from their mistakes before the screen goes black. June 4th, 2009. The Bavarian Alps, on the border between Germany and Austria. This is a world of vertical stone and freezing wind, a place where the smallest mistake usually results in a closed casket. But today, the mountains seem to grant a rare mercy. 49-year-old Karin Holz, an experienced hiker from Germany, was navigating the treacherous slopes of the Untersberg Massif. It was a clear day, perfect for climbing, but the geology of the Alps is unforgiving. One loose pebble, one shift in balance, and the laws of physics took over. Karin lost her footing. She tumbled violently down a steep, jagged ravine, sliding over razor-sharp rocks and debris. By all accounts, this fall should have been fatal. But against all odds, friction and luck conspired to save her. She came to a halt on a narrow, precarious ledge, battered and in severe pain, but alive. She was conscious. She could move. She had survived the mountain's attempt to kill her. Her husband, watching from the trail above in terrified silence, immediately dialed emergency services. The system worked with military precision. Within minutes, the silence of the valley was broken by the rhythmic, thumping roar of a rescue helicopter. To Karin, lying broken on that cold ledge, that sound was the music of salvation. It was the ultimate promise of the modern world. No matter where you fall, civilization has the technology to come and get you. The helicopter, a bright yellow machine operated by a highly trained Austrian rescue crew, hovered above the ravine. The downwash from the rotors kicked up dust and snow, creating a chaotic storm. But the crew was calm. They were professionals. They had done this hundreds of times. A paramedic descended on a winch cable, a long line operation designed for terrain where landing is impossible. He reached Karin. He assessed her injuries. Chest trauma, fractures, shock, but she was stable. The hard part was over. The narrative was set for a happy ending. The paramedics secured Karin into a specialized rescue stretcher, a heavy-duty rescue bag, designed to protect the human body from the elements and gravity. Every buckle was clicked. Every strap was tightened. The paramedic signaled to the pilot above. "Ready for extraction." The winch motor engaged. The cable went taut. Slowly, smoothly, Karin Holz was lifted off the cruel rocks. She was now airborne, suspended beneath the belly of the helicopter, ascending toward the blue sky. She was no longer a victim. She was a patient. Her husband watched from the ground, breathing a sigh of relief. He saw his wife rising to safety, leaving the danger zone. The rescue was a textbook success. But mechanics do not care about human hope. As the helicopter began to gain altitude, transitioning from a hover to forward flight to clear the tree line, the physics of the lift shifted. The payload, the stretcher bearing Karin, swayed slightly in the powerful rotor wash. The entire weight of her life hung on a single connection point, the coupling that linked the stretcher to the hoist rope. It was a device made of hardened steel, tested for tons of weight, certified by engineers. It was supposed to be unbreakable. And then, the impossible happened. There was no warning, no alarm, just a sharp, metallic snap that was drowned out by the engine noise. The connection failed. In a split second, the tension on the line vanished. The stretcher, with Karin strapped securely inside, detached completely from the helicopter. For a heartbeat, she was weightless, floating in the clear mountain air, a woman who had already been saved. And then, gravity reclaimed its property. Karin fell. This was not a stumble. This was a free fall from the height of a skyscraper. She plummeted nearly 200 meters, over 600 feet. straight down into the abyss she had just been rescued from. The fall was silent and terrifyingly fast. The stretcher impacted the valley floor with devastating force. The impact was absolute. The kinetic energy of the fall resulted in immediate, catastrophic trauma to the body. There was no room for miracles this time. The transition from rescued survivor to fatality occurred in the blink of an eye. The husband, who seconds before had been thanking God for her rescue, was left standing in the deafening silence, watching the empty rope sway in the wind. The paramedic, still attached to the line, could only watch in horror as his patient disappeared into the void. The subsequent investigation was a forensic nightmare. Experts analyzed the carabiners, the rope, the locking mechanisms. They spoke of dynamic rollout, a rare phenomenon where a carabiner can twist and unclip itself if the rope hits the gate at a precise fatal angle. Others argued it was a material defect. But for the family, the technical cause was irrelevant compared to the chilling irony. Karen Holtz had beaten the mountain. She had survived the slip. She had waited for help. She died not because she was lost, but because she was found. The very machine sent to save her life became the instrument of her execution. It is a stark reminder that in the equation of survival, safety is never a guarantee. It is just an illusion that holds until the rope snaps. October 14th, 2011. Monroe, North Carolina. The timeline of a tragedy is not measured in years, but in the brutal ticking of seconds. For 24-year-old David Furr, the distance between a miracle and death was less than 50 feet. It was a dark, moonless night on a rural stretch of unlit asphalt. David was behind the wheel, navigating the solitude of the drive. But at high speed, physics is a jealous master. In a fleeting moment of distraction or a loss of traction, the car's equilibrium was lost. The tires caught the soft shoulder of the ditch, and the laws of motion took over. The car didn't just slide, it tripped. The vehicle launched into a chaotic, violent rollover, flipping multiple times in a cloud of dust and debris. The sound was deafening. Metal grinding against asphalt, glass shattering, and the chassis groaning under immense G-forces. To an outside observer, the wreckage tumbling into the darkness looked like a coffin of twisted steel. It was a crash that should have been fatal, but modern engineering is a marvel of survival. The crumple zones absorbed the impact. The safety cage held its shape. The airbags deployed to cushion the human cargo. When the car finally came to a rest, upside down and smoking, silence rushed back into the night. Inside the ruined cabin, David opened his eyes. He checked his limbs. Incredibly, he was intact. Aside from the ringing in his ears and the rush of adrenaline, he was unhurt. He unbuckled his seatbelt and crawled out through the shattered window frame. He stood up in the cool night air, shaking the glass from his clothes. This was the moment of absolute euphoria. He had cheated death. He had walked away from a mangle of metal without a scratch. His brain was likely processing the logistics. Call a tow truck, call the police, call his family. He was the lucky one. He was safe. But in the chaos, a critical detail had gone unnoticed. During its violent tumble, the vehicle had collided with a utility pole. The impact snapped the wooden support like a twig, bringing high-voltage lines crashing down. These were not harmless telephone cords. They were carriers of lethal industrial current. In the pitch black of the rural night, the wire was invisible. A silent black snake lying dormant in the tall grass, waiting for a ground connection. It was not sparking. It was not humming. It was simply waiting. David, driven by the instinct to get away from the smoking vehicle, turned and walked toward the edge of the road. He was doing exactly what a survivor is supposed to do, seeking safety. He was looking for a spot to get a clear cell signal or simply to distance himself from the wreck. He took one step, then another. He was alive. He was breathing. He was planning his tomorrow. And then he stepped onto the wet grass where the downed line lay hidden. The moment his foot made contact, the circuit was completed. The human body is a perfect conductor. 12,000 volts of raw power surged through him instantly. There was no time to react, no time to scream. The massive electrical discharge struck his heart, overriding the body's natural impulses. It caused immediate ventricular fibrillation. The heart muscle quivered uselessly instead of pumping blood. The brain was starved of oxygen in seconds. David Furr collapsed, not from the car accident that destroyed his vehicle, but from the invisible force he had unwittingly unleashed. When emergency responders arrived, they found a scene of confusing duality. They found the car, destroyed beyond recognition. And nearby, they found the driver, with no trauma from the impact, lying still in the grass. He had survived the kinetic violence only to fall victim to the electrical aftermath. It is a chilling lesson. David had survived the obvious threat, but failed to account for the hidden one. He had walked out of a steel cage designed to save him, directly into a trap no engineer could protect him from. He made the right choice to leave the wreck, but luck had abandoned him on the walkaway. The universe allowed him to survive the fall, only to collect its due when he thought he was finally safe. January 27, 2013, Santa Maria, Brazil. This date marks one of the darkest chapters in South American history, a night when a simple celebration turned into a national funeral. The tragedy at the Kiss Nightclub was a perfect, horrific storm of negligence and bad luck. A band performed with outdoor pyrotechnics inside a soundproofed room lined with highly flammable acoustic foam. It took only seconds for the sparks to ignite the ceiling. The burning foam didn't just produce heat. It released a lethal cloud of cyanide and carbon monoxide, turning the crowded dance floor into a toxic trap. Within minutes, 242 young university students were dead. They didn't die from the flames, they died from the air they breathed. It was a tragedy of the innocent. At the center of this looming catastrophe stood 21-year-old Jessica de Lima Roll. She was not merely a passive attendee. She was one of the key organizers of the party. She had spent weeks selling tickets, promoting the event to her peers, and gathering her friends. By all laws of probability, she should have been standing in the VIP area, right in the path of the toxic smoke, when the band struck the first chord. Her presence there was mandatory. Her probability of death was near absolute. But fate introduced a variable in the form of her boyfriend, 20-year-old Adriano Stefanel. Hours before the party began, a mundane disagreement, or perhaps a simple change of heart, occurred. Adriano, who lived in a neighboring town, called Jessica. He insisted that she not go to the club that night. He urged her to stay home. It was a simple request, the kind of couples negotiation that happens millions of times a day without consequence. Reluctantly, Jessica agreed. She stayed home. That single decision, made in a casual phone call, severed her from the timeline of the tragedy. That night, while her friends suffocated in the panic and darkness of the Kiss nightclub, Jessica slept safely in her bed. When she woke up the next morning, her world had changed. She was surrounded by a landscape of absolute grief. The phone calls came in waves. News of friends dead, classmates missing, the city in mourning. Jessica was widely cited in the media as the girl who lived, a miracle survivor who escaped the inferno because of a simple twist of romance. She had cheated the statistical probability of death. She was safe. For the next 5 days, Jessica lived in what can only be described as a borrowed timeline. She attended vigils, she mourned. She breathed the fresh air that 242 of her peers could no longer breathe. She was the living embodiment of a second chance. But the universe demands balance, and the laws of physics are relentless. On passing the 5-day mark, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by the routine of life. On the evening of the 5th day, Jessica traveled to the neighboring town of Toledo. Her goal was simple. She was going to pick up Adriano, the man who had unknowingly saved her life, from his job. They were together in their Volkswagen Golf, traveling along Highway PR 444. It was a standard drive, the kind performed on autopilot. But highways are kinetic environments where massive objects move at lethal speeds, separated only by thin painted lines. As they navigated the road, a heavy commercial truck loaded with corn was traveling in the opposite direction. Physics does not care about irony, and it does not care about survivors. In a powerful disruption of traffic flow, the Volkswagen and the heavy truck collided. The specifics of the mechanical failure or driver error are secondary to the brutal reality of the impact. A compact car weighing just over a ton is no match for a fully loaded industrial transport. The collision was catastrophic. The crumple zones of the Volkswagen were overwhelmed instantly by the sheer mass of the truck. The deceleration forces transferred directly to the occupants. Jessica de Lima Roll, the girl who had successfully avoided the toxic gas and the fire of the nightclub, suffered immediate, fatal traumatic injuries. She died instantly in the wreckage of the car. When emergency crews arrived, they found a grim tableau that defied logic. Adriano, the boyfriend who had intervened to save her from the fire, was pulled from the twisted metal alive. He survived the crash with injuries, destined to live with the double trauma of saving her once, only to lose her 5 days later. The narrative symmetry is chilling. Jessica had been granted a reprieve of exactly 120 hours. She had escaped a stationary death trap filled with smoke, only to be claimed by a moving death trap made of steel. It serves as a dark reminder that escaping a disaster does not grant immunity from the mundane dangers of daily life. The road is just as indifferent as the fire. She survived the historical event, only to become a statistic on a quiet highway. August 1st, 1985. New Orleans, Louisiana. There is a specific kind of irony that feels less like a coincidence and more like a cruel joke written by the universe. This story is the absolute definition of that irony. The setting was the New Orleans Recreation Department pool, a massive public facility shimmering under the humid summer sun. The occasion was a party, but not just any gathering. This was a celebration of professional excellence. The lifeguards of New Orleans were gathering to celebrate a historic achievement. They had just completed their first ever summer season without a single drowning fatality at any of their pools. It was a safety party. The mood was euphoric. The air smelled of chlorine, barbecue smoke, and triumph. For a swimmer, this specific location at this specific moment was statistically the safest place on the planet. There were approximately 200 people in attendance. Of those guests, over 100 were fully certified, elite lifeguards. These were men and women trained to spot a struggling swimmer from 50 yards away, experts in CPR, professionals whose entire existence was dedicated to the preservation of life in water. To add to the security, 4 lifeguards were officially on duty during the party, patrolling the deck while their colleagues celebrated. The pool was literally wall-to-wall with safety experts. It was a fortress of vigilance. Among the guests was 31-year-old Jerome Moody. He was not a lifeguard. He was a guest, there to enjoy the water and the atmosphere of success. As the afternoon wore on, the pool filled with splashing, laughter, and the chaotic noise of celebration. And this is where the fallacy of safety reveals itself. We assume that safety is cumulative, that 100 pairs of eyes are better than one, but psychology tells us otherwise. In a phenomenon known as the diffusion of responsibility, the more people present, the less likely any single individual is to act. Everyone assumes someone else is watching. Amidst the hundreds of trained eyes, Jerome Moody slipped into the deep end of the pool. Drowning is not what it looks like in the movies. There is no splashing, no yelling for help, no waving of arms. It is a silent, deceptive event. The instinctive drowning response takes over. The body goes vertical, the mouth sinks below the surface, and the victim is physically unable to call out because they are fighting just to breathe. Jerome Moody began to die in the middle of a crowded room. He sank beneath the surface, surrounded by the best rescue swimmers in the state. The refraction of the water, the glare of the sun, and the turbulence caused by dozens of other swimmers created a veil of invisibility. He drifted to the bottom of the pool's deep end and settled on the concrete floor, motionless. Above him, the party continued. His body was separated from the celebration by only 8 feet of water. The lifeguards drank sodas, congratulated each other on their perfect record, and laughed, completely unaware that their record had already been broken right beneath their feet. The party eventually wound down. The guests dried off, packed their bags, and cleared the deck. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water. The 4 on-duty lifeguards began their final sweep to close the facility. They walked the perimeter, checking the filters and the lanes. It was only then, when the water stilled and the ripples faded, that the illusion of safety shattered. At the bottom of the deep end, they saw a dark, still shape. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The lifeguards dove in, pulling Jerome Moody to the surface. They dragged him onto the concrete deck, the same deck where they had just been celebrating their success. They initiated CPR immediately. It was a surreal, frantic scene. The very people celebrating a drowning-free season were now desperately trying to reverse a drowning that had happened in their midst. But physics and biology are unforgiving. Jerome had been submerged for too long. His lungs were filled with water. His brain had been starved of oxygen. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy confirmed death by asphyxiation due to submersion. The verdict was accidental drowning, but the context transformed this accident into a psychological horror story. Jerome Moody didn't just drown. He drowned at a party held to celebrate that no one had drowned. He died surrounded by a literal army of rescuers who were too busy celebrating their vigilance to be vigilant. It serves as a devastating reminder that safety is not a static condition guaranteed by the presence of experts. Safety is an active, fragile state that disappears the moment you believe you have achieved it. The safest place on Earth became a tomb because everyone believed it was impossible for it to be anything else. October 22nd, 1926, Montreal, Canada. Harry Houdini was not merely a performer, he was a living god of the impossible. For decades, he had built a global reputation on a single, defiant premise. No cage, no chain, and no trap could hold him. He had escaped from sealed milk cans filled with water, from straitjackets while suspended upside down from skyscrapers, and from buried coffins clawing his way through 6 feet of earth. He courted death every single night under the bright lights of the stage, turning suffocation and drowning into a spectator sport. He was 52 years old, a physical specimen of iron will and conditioned muscle, believing himself to be invincible. But the irony of Houdini's life is that while he spent years preparing for grand, theatrical deaths, his end came not from a dangerous stunt, but from a moment of casual, unscripted stupidity in a room where he felt completely safe. It was the afternoon after a matinee show at the Princess Theater. Houdini was resting in his dressing room, a private sanctuary away from the danger of the stage. He was lying on a couch, sorting through his fan mail, tired but gracious. There were no water tanks here, no locks, no hidden keys. He was just a man relaxing in his bathrobe. A group of students from McGill University knocked and entered to pay their respects. Among them was J. Gordon Whitehead, a young man with a background in boxing and a curiosity about the magician's legends. The conversation turned to Houdini's physical strength. It was a common claim in Houdini's publicity machine that he had an iron stomach, capable of withstanding the hardest punch from any man without injury. It was a trick of physiology he had mastered. By sharply exhaling and contracting his rectus abdominis muscles, he created a rigid shield of armor that absorbed impact. Whitehead, eager to test the myth, asked a simple, direct question. "Is it true, Mr. Houdini, that you can resist the hardest punches to the stomach?" Houdini, distracted by his letters and perhaps weary from the performance, nodded absent-mindedly. He gave his consent. But in the theater of magic, timing is everything, and here, the timing was fatal. Houdini began to rise from the couch, but he did not have time to prepare. He did not have the second he needed to brace his core. Before the magician could tighten his muscles, Whitehead struck. It was not a playful tap. The student delivered a series of violent, rapid-fire hooks with full force, driving his fist into Houdini's midsection. The blows did not hit a wall of muscle. They hit the soft, relaxed tissue of a man who wasn't ready. The force transferred directly through the abdominal wall and impacted the internal organs. Houdini gasped, his face twisting in genuine shock and pain. He waved the student off, signaling him to stop. Slowly, painfully, he regained his composure. He stood up, tightened his core, and reportedly said, "That will do." He played the part of the Superman to the end, refusing to show weakness to a stranger. But inside, a catastrophe had occurred. The blunt force trauma had likely ruptured his appendix or aggravated an existing inflammation to the point of acute rupture. The clock had started ticking. For the next few days, Houdini lived in a state of medical denial. He was in agony, unable to sleep, suffering from what he thought was a muscular injury. He traveled by train to Detroit for his next run of shows, shivering with a fever that spiked to 104 degrees. His body was screaming for help, pumping toxins into his bloodstream as peritonitis, a lethal abdominal infection, began to consume him. But Houdini was a man who had trained himself to ignore pain. He believed his will was stronger than his biology. On October 24th, he took the stage in Detroit. He was dying on his feet. He collapsed during the show, revived, and continued performing, fueled by sheer adrenaline and hubris. He refused to go to the hospital until it was physically impossible to stand. By the time surgeons opened him up, his abdomen was filled with poison. The infection was irreversible. The man who had survived the Chinese water torture cell lay helpless in a sterile hospital bed, defeated by a bacterial invasion caused by a cheap shot. He died on Halloween, October 31st, 1926. The irony is suffocating. Houdini spent his life flirting with complex engineered death traps, only to escape at the last second. He was prepared for every mechanical failure, every lock, every knot. But he wasn't prepared for a surprise punch in a dressing room. He died because he didn't have 2 seconds to tighten a muscle. The greatest escape artist in history couldn't escape the enthusiasm of a fan who simply wanted to see if the legend was true. It was a death that wasn't grand or mysterious. It was accidental, painful, and entirely preventable. The man who conquered steel and water was ultimately destroyed by a question and a fist in a quiet room. May 31, 2009, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The story of Johanna Ganthaler is a chilling study in the mechanics of destiny, a narrative that forces us to question whether we can truly outrun our own end. Johanna, a lively pensioner from the province of Bolzano in Italy, had spent a vibrant vacation in Brazil with her husband, Kurt. They were suntanned, relaxed, and ready to return to their quiet life in the Alps. Their ticket home was booked on Air France Flight 447, a scheduled overnight service from Rio to Paris. This particular flight number is now synonymous with one of the greatest aviation mysteries and tragedies of the 21st century. On the day of departure, the chaotic traffic of Rio, or perhaps a simple misreading of the clock, interfered with their schedule. It was a mundane frustration familiar to any traveler. The rush to the terminal, the breathless sprint to the check-in desk, and the sinking feeling of seeing the gate closed. Johanna and Kurt stood at the window, likely angry and exhausted, watching the Airbus A330 pull away from the jet bridge without them. They had missed their flight by mere minutes. That plane, carrying 28 souls, took off into the night sky over the Atlantic Ocean. Hours later, it encountered a massive storm system, suffered a catastrophic sensor failure, and plunged into the dark waters, killing everyone on board. When the news broke the next morning, the anger Johanna felt about missing the plane instantly transformed into a cold, trembling shock. The realization was absolute. Their lateness had not been an inconvenience. It had been a divine intervention. They were the statistical anomalies, the lucky ones who had stood on the precipice of death and stepped back just in time. The couple was stranded in Brazil for a few more days, contacting terrified relatives to tell them, "We are alive, we missed the plane." They were celebrated as miracles. They managed to book a flight back to Europe shortly after, carrying the heavy, surreal knowledge that they were living on borrowed time. They landed safely in Munich, Germany, retrieved their car, and began the final leg of their journey home. They were driving south toward the Italian border, navigating the solid, familiar roads of Austria. The psychological relief must have been immense. They were no longer suspended over the hostile ocean in a metal tube. They were on the ground, in their own vehicle, in control. They had survived the global headline tragedy. They were safe. But the timeline of fate is not easily disrupted. On June 9th, while driving near the town of Kufstein in the Austrian Tyrol, the physics of the highway took over. It was a clear day on a standard European road. For reasons that remain a mix of fatigue or momentary distraction, their vehicle drifted. The car crossed the center line, moving directly into the path of oncoming traffic. In a tragic, ironic mirror of the forces that destroyed Flight 447, their small car collided head-on with a heavy truck. The physics of a head-on collision are brutal and unforgiving. The combined speed of the two vehicles created an impact force that caused catastrophic structural failure to the vehicle. Johanna Ganthaler, the woman who had cheated gravity and the Atlantic Ocean, suffered immediate fatal traumatic injuries. She died instantly in the wreckage, trapped in twisted metal on a safe European road. Her husband, Kurt, was critically injured but survived, destined to live with the haunting memory of being saved from the air, only to be crushed on the ground. The news of her death sent a shockwave through the media. Not because of the crash itself, car accidents happen every day, but because of the context. Johanna had been granted a reprieve. She had avoided a death by water and ice at 35,000 feet, only to be claimed by asphalt and steel at ground level just days later. It was as if the universe had noticed a clerical error, a name that was supposed to be crossed off the list, and moved to correct it with ruthless efficiency. The story of Johanna Ganthaler serves as a terrifying reminder of the illusion of control. We build safety systems, we check schedules, and we celebrate our near misses, believing we have navigated the danger. But the destination remains the same. Johanna traveled thousands of miles to escape a historical catastrophe, only to find her fate waiting for her in a truck lane on the drive home. She survived the impossible, only to be killed by the mundane. We call them survivors, but they were just victims on a delayed timer. Here is the question that defines you. If you knew you had exactly 5 days left to live after surviving a disaster, would you want to know the countdown, or would you prefer the ignorance of hope? Be honest. Would the knowledge destroy you or free you? Drop your verdict in the comments. Like this video if you respect the reality of death, and subscribe.